morning. The man was seated upon the ground, holding a stone anvil between his feet, while with his hands he turned and chipped with great skill a spearhead he was making out of flint. It was about the only pastime he had, and his little yellow eyes gleamed with a craftsman's pleasure. His shaggy round shoulders were bent over the task. The chips flew in quick particles, and the wood echoed musically as the artificer watched the thing under his hands take form and fashion. Presently I spoke, and the worker looked up, not too pleased at being thus interrupted. But he was easy of propitiation, and over a handful of dried raisins communicative. How, I asked, knowing a craftsman's craft is often the nearest thing to his heart. How was it such things as that which he chipped came to be thought of by him and his? Whereon the woodman, having spit out the raisin stones and wiped his fingers on his fur, said in substance that the first weapon was fashioned when the earliest ape hurled the first stone in wrath. But, chum, I said, taking up his half-finished spear and touching the razor-fine edge with admiring caution, from hurling the crude pebble to fashioning such as this is a long stride. Who first edged and pointed the primitive malice? What man with the soul of 1,000 unborn fighters in him notched and sharpened your natural rock? Whereupon the chipper grinned, and answered that, when the woodman had found stones that would crack skulls, it came upon them presently that they would crack nuts as well. And cracking nuts between two stones one day a flint shattered, and there on the grass was the golden secret of the edge, the thing that has made man what he is. Yet again, good fellow, I queried, even this happy chance only gives us a weapon, sharp no doubt, and calculated to do 100 services for any 10 the original pebble could have done, but still unhandled, small in force, imperfect. Now tell me, which of your amicable ancestors first put a handle to the fashioned flint, and how he thought of it? The workman had done his flake by now, and wrapping it in a bit of skin, put it carefully in his belt before turning to answer my question. Who made the first handle for the first flint, you of many questions? She did. She, the mother, he suddenly cried, patting the earth with his brown hand, and working himself up as he spoke. Made it in her heart, for us, her firstborn. See, here is such as the first handled weapon that ever came out of darkness. And he snatched from the ground, where it had lain hidden underneath his fox-skin cloak, a heavy club. I saw in an instant how it was. The club had been a sapling, and the sapling's roots had grown about it and circled with a splendid grip a lump of native flint. A woodman had pulled the sapling, found the flint, and fashioned the two in a moment of happy inspiration, the one to an axe head, the other to a handle, as they lay nature welded. This, I say, this is the first, screamed the old fellow as though I were contradicting him, thumping the ground with his weapon, and working himself up into a fury as its black magic entered his being. This is the first. With this I slew Heder and Gur, and those who plundered my hiding places in the woods. With this I have killed a score of others, bursting their heads and cracking their bones like dry sticks. With this, but here his rage rendered him inarticulate. He stammered and stuttered for a minute, and then as the killing fury settled on him, his yellow teeth shut with a sudden snap, while through them his breath rattled like wind through dead pine branches in December. The sinews sat up on his hands, as his fingers tightened upon the axe haft like the roots of the same pines from the ground when winter rain has washed the soil from beneath them. His small eyes gleamed like baleful planets. Every hair upon his shaggy back grew stiff and erect. Another minute, and my span were ended. With a leap from where I sat, I flew at that hairy beast, and sinking my fist deep in his throttle, shook him till his eyes blazed with delirious fires. We waltzed across the short greensward, and in and out about the tree trunks, shaking, pulling, and hitting as we went, till at last I felt the man's vigour dying within him. A little more shaking, a sudden twist, and he was lying on the ground before me, senseless and civil. That is the worst of some orators, I thought to myself, as I gloomily gathered up the scattered fragments of my lunch. They never know when they have said enough. They are too apt to be carried away by their own arguments. That inhospitable village was left behind in full belief the mountain looming in the south could be reached before nightfall, while the road to its left would serve as sure guide to food and shelter for the evening. But as it turned out, the morning's haze developed a strong mist ere the afternoon was half gone, through which it was impossible to see more than 20 yards. My hill loomed gigantic for a time with a tantalizing appearance of being only a mile or two ahead, then wavered, became visionary, and finally disappeared as completely as though the forest mist had drunk it up bodily. There was still the road to guide me, a fairly well beaten track twining through the glades, but even the best of highways are difficult in fog, and this one was complicated by various side paths, made probably by hunters or bark cutters, and without compass or guide marks it was necessary to advance with extreme caution, or get helplessly mazed. An hour's steady tramping brought me nowhere in particular, and stopping for a minute to consider, I picked a few wild fruit, such as my woodcutter friend had eaten, from an overhanging bush, and in doing so slipped, the soil having become damp, and in falling broke a branch off. The incident was only important from what follows. Picking myself up, perhaps a little shaken by the jolt, I set off again in what seemed the plain road, and being by this time displeased by my surroundings, determined to make a push for civilization before the rapidly gathering darkness settled down. Hands in pockets and collar up, I marched forward at a good round pace for an hour, constantly straining my eyes for a sight of the hill, and ears for some indications of living beings in the deathly hush of the shrouded woods, and at the end of that time, feeling sure habitations must now be near, arrived at what looked like a little open space, somehow seeming rather familiar in its vague outlines. Where had I seen such a place before? Sauntering round the margin, a bush with a broken branch suddenly attracted my attention. A broken bush with a long slide in the mud below it, and the stamp of navy boots in the soft turf. I glared at those signs for a moment, then with an exclamation of chagrin recognized them only too well. It was the bush whence I had picked the fruit, and the mark of my fall. An hour's hard walking round some accursed woodland track had brought me exactly back to the point I had started from. I was lost. It really seemed to get 20% darker as I made that abominable discovery, and the position dawned in all its uncomfortable intensity. There was nothing for it but to start off again, this time judging my direction only by a light breath of air drifting the mist tangles before it. And therein I made a great mistake, for the breeze had shifted several points from the quarter whence it blew in the morning. Knowing nothing of this, I went forward with as much light-heartedness as could be managed, humming a song to myself, and carefully putting aside thoughts of warmth and supper, while the dusk increased and the great forest vegetation seemed to grow ranker and closer at every step. Another disconcerting thing was that the ground sloped gradually downwards, not upwards as it should have done, till it seemed the path lay across the flats of a forest-covered plain, which did not conform to my wish of striking a road on the foothills of a mountain. However, I plodded on, drawing some small comfort from the fact that as darkness came the mist rose from the ground and appeared to condense in a ghostly curtain 20 feet overhead, where it hung between me and a clear night sky, presently illuminated by starlight with the strangest effect. Tired, footsore and dejected, I struggled on a little further. Oh, for a cab, I laughed bitterly to myself. Oh, for even the humble necessary omnibus of civilization. Oh, for the humblest tuck shop, where a mug of hot coffee and a snack could be had by a homeless wanderer. And as I thought and plodded savagely on, collar up, hands in pockets, through the black tangles of that endless wood, suddenly the sound of wailing children caught my ear. It was the softest, saddest music ever mortal listened to. It was as though scores of babes in pain were dropping to sleep on their mother's breast, and all hushing their sorrows with one accord in a common melancholy chorus. I stood spellbound at that elfin wailing, the first sound to break the deathly stillness of the road for an hour or more, and my blood tingled as I listened to it. Nevertheless, here was what I was looking for. Where there were weeping children, there must be habitations, and shelter, and, splendid thought, supper. Poor little babes. Their crying was the deadliest, sweetest thing in sorrows I ever listened to. If it was colic, why, I knew a little medicine, and in gratitude for that prospective supper, I had a soul big enough to cure 1,000. And if they were in disgrace, and by some quaint Martian fashion had suffered simultaneous punishment for baby offences, I would plead for them. In fact, I fairly set off at a run towards the sobbing, in the black, wet night air ahead, and tripping as I ran, looked down and saw in the filtering starlight that the forest grass had given place to an ancient roadway, paved with moss-grown flagstones, such as they still used in Seth. Without stopping to think what that might mean, I hurried on, the wailing now right ahead, a tremendous tumult of gentle grief rising and falling on the night air like the sound of a sea after a storm.